Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're looking at a really interesting paper, one that kind of flips the script on how we think environmental policy actually gets implemented, or maybe how it doesn't always work as planned when it hits the real world, commerce, law. We're focusing on ecosystem-based fisheries management, an Australian perspective. The lead author is James P. Scandola, and it was published way back in 2005 in Aquatic Living Resources. It's not just theory, it's really an investigation into a major policy shift down under. Okay, let's get into it. Our goal today is to really unpack the paper's main argument, which is, well, pretty provocative. Most people assume ecosystem-based fisheries management, EBFM, came about because of, major scientific breakthroughs in ecology. But Scandol argues, no, not really. He says EBFM in Australia wasn't primarily science-driven. It was fundamentally a re-expression, almost a rebranding of existing policies, specifically this idea of ecologically sustainable development, or ESD, that Australia had already committed to.
Yeah, and that's the fascinating bit, the causality. The paper makes a strong case that the real driver wasn't some eureka moment in marine science. It was policy, and maybe even more so, legal requirements, specifically environmental impact assessments, EIAs, being applied to fisheries, especially after some key court cases in New South Wales.
Right.
So we're looking at a situation where the management framework was almost forced into being by law, and then the science sort of had to catch up and figure out how to make it work.
That's a crucial distinction. Law and policy pulling the science along, not the other way around. So, okay, before we dig into how that happened, let's just clarify the terms. EBFM, EBM, EAF.
Yeah.
You hear these acronyms all the time. Are they different?
Well, for the purposes of this discussion and how the paper treats implementation, they're basically used synonymously. EBM, EAF, ecosystem approach to fisheries, it all points to the same core idea.
Which is?
You can't just manage one type of fish by itself, right? You've got to look at the whole system, the habitat, the other species it interacts with, the food web, even the human activities impacting it. It's holistic.
Okay. And this wasn't invented in Australia either. The paper points out the international context. The UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, they defined the ecosystem approach to fisheries, EAF, back in the early 2000s, as the way to actually implement the FAO's Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries from 1995. The ultimate goal even then was always framed as achieving sustainable development.
Okay. So if EBFM is essentially just a structured method for reaching sustainable development, that links directly back to the paper's main point about Australia because, as you said, the government there had already signed up to Ecologically Sustainable Development, ESD, back in the early 90s.
Exactly. That earlier ESD commitment created the policy scaffolding, the legal foundation that was sort of waiting to be used. And if you look at the core principles of EBFM or EAF, things like limiting ecosystem impacts, maintaining ecological relationships, using a precautionary approach, ensuring good governance, they map almost perfectly onto the sustainability indicators that were already part of Australia's ESD framework.
So EBFM just became the how-to guide? Pretty much. It became the operational way for fisheries managers to demonstrate they were meeting those existing ESD goals.
Okay, so the policy groundwork was there. But the paper argues it didn't really bite until the legal system got involved. Implementing this stuff is hard, it's expensive.
Absolutely. It requires balancing public good, environmental protection with, private commercial realities, and that often needs a strong push.
And that push came from legislation.
Yes, big time. On the federal level, you had the Commonwealth Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, the EPBC Act from 1999. By 2002, critical amendments came in. These required strategic environmental assessments for any Commonwealth fishery wanting an export permit.
An export permit. So this affects international trade.
Directly. If you managed a major fishery like tuna or prawns and wanted to sell overseas, you suddenly had a deadline. You had to prove through this assessment process that your fishery was sustainable. And the deadline was tight end of 2005. It was a serious motivator.
I bet. An existential threat for some, probably.
Definitely forced the issue at the Commonwealth level. But the paper argues the really seismic shift happened in New South Wales at the state level. There was a landmark court decision in 1999, Sustainable Fisheries and Tourism, Inc. versus the NSW Minister for Fisheries. The court ruled that the state's main environmental planning law, the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act 1979, actually applied to issuing commercial fishing licenses.
Wait, hang on. Just renewing a standard fishing license? Suddenly required.
What?
A full environmental impact assessment?
That's what the court said. A full environmental impact statement and EIS.
Wow. That must have sent shockwaves through the industry.
It did. It basically meant the government couldn't issue or renew licenses without this incredibly detailed, costly, and time-consuming environmental review for every fishery. It could have brought commercial fishing to a standstill, so naturally it forced the state government's hand.
They had to change the law.
They had to amend the Fisheries Management Act quickly, and they created this thing called the Strategic Environmental Assessment Process, the SEA. Under this new system, the Fishery Management Strategy, or FMS, for each fishery became the central document that gets assessed. The paper sums it up nicely for NSW. ESD is the goal of sustainability. And EBFM, implemented through this SEA process, became the how, the actual mechanism to get there.
Okay, this SEA process sounds crucial then. If it's meant to deliver on EBFM, which covers the whole ecosystem, what does this assessment actually involve? It must be huge.
It is, and that's where you immediately see the complexity and, frankly, the cost ballooning.
Yeah.
The SCA and NSW is specifically designed, written into the law, to capture not just ecological factors, but economic and social ones, too.
Okay.
It's not just, counting the target fish stock. The assessment legally has to consider over 20 different components.
20. Can you give some examples? What kind of things are we talking about?
Sure. On the ecological side, obviously, they look at the species being caught, the retained species. But also, crucially, bycatch, the non-target stuff. They have to assess impacts on the food web, the trophic structure, damage to habitats like the seafloor, effects on protected or threatened species, even things like water quality impacts from fishing.
That's incredibly comprehensive just on the eco side.
It is. You're jumping straight from traditional single-species thinking into full-blown systems ecology.
And you said it includes economic and social dimensions, too.
Yep. The SEA has to consider the economic viability of the fishery, employment impacts, effects on coastal communities. It even has to look at impacts on indigenous and European cultural heritage sites or values associated with the fishing areas.
So you're assessing if the fishery is sustainable environmentally and economically and socially all at once.
That's the goal. It forces this incredibly broad consultative process.
How does any fishery actually get through that? It sounds massively bureaucratic.
Well, it is definitely involved. It's designed to be transparent. Multiple drafts of the assessment documents are usually required. These go through management advisory committees, which include industry reps, scientists, managers. And there's mandatory consultation with, everyone. Commercial fishers, recreational fishers, environmental groups, indigenous communities.
Trying to capture all those different values tied to the resource.
Exactly. It's an attempt to formalize and balance all those competing interests within this assessment framework.
Okay, so the policy and legal framework is now enormous, complex, and mandatory. Let's pivot to the science. The scientists are now expected to provide the information for this massive assessment. This is where things often get tricky with EBFM.
Right, yeah. This is probably the biggest challenge highlighted. It's the translation problem. You have policymakers setting these very broad aspirational goals like preserve the natural structure and function of ecosystems. Sounds good, right?
Sure, but what does it mean in practice?
Exactly. How do you measure natural structure and function? What are the specific quantifiable indicators? What are the trigger points where you say, okay, we've crossed a line, we need to act? Scientists really struggle to turn that high-level policy language into something operationally useful and measurable at the whole ecosystem level.
Because the data often just isn't there.
Partly data, partly the sheer complexity, and partly the methods. The paper makes a good point about traditional science. The gold standard is experimentation, right? Randomize, replicate, control.
Yeah.
Well, you just can't do that with an entire fishery ecosystem spread over hundreds of kilometers of coast.
You can't fence off half the ocean for an experiment.
Precisely. It's logistically impossible, incredibly expensive, and, frankly, politically unacceptable. You can't tell half the fishing fleet to stop fishing for 10 years just to see what happens.
And what about the big ecosystem models, things like EcoPath or EcoSim? Don't they help?
They can, potentially. The paper acknowledges their power, but it also flags a major issue. They have an impressive appetite for data, as the authors put it.
Meaning they need lots of information.
Tons of it. They need long-term data, time series on the biomass and interactions of all the key parts of the food web, plankton, small fish, big fish, predators. And for most fisheries, especially the smaller coastal ones in Australia that the paper focuses on, that detailed historical data just doesn't exist.
So the fancy models might not be usable if you don't have the decades of data to feed them.
Right. Without that data, the model outputs are based on a lot of assumptions, and their reliability becomes questionable for actual management decisions.
Okay, so we have this legally mandated system demanding proof of ecosystem sustainability. But the gold standard science is impossible, and the complex models need data that isn't there. Sounds like a dead end.
It could have been, but necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention.
What did they do?
Faced with these limitations, not enough time, not enough money, not enough data, Australian researchers had to get pragmatic. They developed and refined qualitative risk assessment methods.
Qualitative, so
Yes.
not purely number crunching.
Not entirely. Instead of trying to perfectly quantify everything, which was impossible, these methods focus on identifying and prioritizing the biggest risks. They break the ecosystem down conceptually different habitats, different species groups, target, bycatch, protected, key ecological processes. Then, using the best available information, which might include fisher knowledge and expert opinion alongside limited data, they assess the likelihood and consequence of the fishery impacting each component.
So it's like a triage system. Find the ecological hotspots where the fishery poses the greatest threat.
That's a great way to put it. It allows managers to focus limited resources, research, monitoring, management actions on the highest priority issues, rather than getting bogged down trying to measure everything perfectly.
That makes sense. And it really reinforces the paper's central theme, doesn't it? That EBFM implementation was driven by practical policy needs and legal constraints, not just pure science.
Absolutely. It highlights that EBFM is inherently value-based. The term eco itself in this policy and legal context starts to carry broader societal values, not just strict ecological definitions.
There's also the money aspect. You mentioned cost before. Who pays for all this assessment and research?
Ah, yes. The paper points to the principle of internalizing environmental costs. Basically, the polluter pays principle.
Meaning the fishing industry foots the bill.
Largely, yes. The cost of doing the required ecological research, running the assessments, monitoring, it often falls directly on the industry being regulated.
But you have this incredibly complex, data-hungry assessment process mandated by law.
Exactly. And then you tell a small-scale coastal fishery, maybe operating on thin margins already, that they now need to fund extensive ecosystem research.
That sounds potentially devastating.
It carries a real risk of severe social and economic impacts, particularly for smaller operators. The paper warns that demanding this level of scientific complexity could simply make some fisheries unviable. And deciding how much research is enough and who pays if the industry genuinely can't afford it becomes a political decision. Public funding for fisheries research has to compete with, hospitals, schools, roads.
So the whole process is deeply political, not just technical.
Inherently so.
And the final big concern raised is just the sheer complexity of it all. Can the management system even cope?
That's the million-dollar question. The paper warns that EBFM risks becoming unworkably complex. Think about it. Fisheries managers often already struggle to develop, understand, and use relatively simple single-species stock assessments effectively.
Right.
Now you're asking them to integrate results from maybe 20 different ecological, economic, and social indicators, all with their own uncertainties and complexities. There's a danger you create a management system that's so intricate. No one fully understands it, it's impossible to maintain, and decision makers can't actually use it effectively.
It becomes too complex to function.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Which leads to the paper's concluding thought about where the real challenge lies.
Which isn't the science itself?
Not primarily, no. Although the science is hard, the authors argue the biggest hurdle for making EBFM work is actually about reorienting the governance structures. The established ways of managing fisheries, making decisions, allocating resources, these need to adapt. They need to become better suited to the very specific place-based nature of fisheries, recognizing that each one is a unique mosaic of local ecological conditions, economic pressures, and social contexts. Management needs to reflect that local reality.
That idea of place-based management feels really important. It links back to those social values and local complexities we talked about. So maybe a final thought for you, our listener, building on that. Given that environmental issues are fundamentally about values, and those values will keep shaping management, how can we better incorporate that local place-based knowledge, the experience of fishers, the understanding of the community, that sense of place the paper touches on into these large, complex, often top-down legal and political frameworks? How do we stop that local wisdom from getting lost in the complexity? Something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into how ecosystem-based fisheries management actually came about in Australia, a story perhaps more about law and policy than pure science.